Are deliberate attempts made to develop tolerance and positive attitudes towards diverse groups?
Yes, so in both teacher to students and students to students. So the way that I usually work with Indigenous students and getting them involved and getting other kids involved is, first of all, learn about their background, ask them about it, ask them to share with the rest of the class, and they're usually more than willing to share. Having a positive attitude towards them, and I think mostly encouraging that from the other students as well. It's about learning to accept different cultures and also to encourage that the storytelling that comes out of the Indigenous culture. So trying to work through assessments and tasks to have that storytelling that they're used to in their culture and that they can practice a little bit more.
Well, we make deliberate attempts to develop tolerance and positive attitudes in the classroom generally, but through the study of, in Year 7, the study of Aboriginal traditional lifestyle and culture. In Year 9, we look at the treatment of Aboriginal Tasmanians and discuss all the issues around that. And in Year 10, we look at the Aboriginals' fight for civil rights in the 20th century. And we discuss all about tolerance and equal rights and all those issues that surround that. In PE, we play Indigenous games during NAIDOC week especially.
Are deliberate attempts made to ensure that Indigenous Australian students are actively engaged in learning?
Only thing I can think of really was when we did, for example, with the Year 9s, we did a unit on Indigenous Australia and we looked at poetry and all those different things. And in that unit, it was giving the Indigenous students in the class really a voice to speak up, because some of the things that came up and some of the research that the students did, because one of the tasks they had to do some research and find out more. And for them, it was, I can tell you about this stuff because it's part of my culture and I know this. And giving them the stage, giving them the voice to stand up and tell the class about that, that actually helped. And that instead of them sitting and researching their own culture, they could actually take from what they know and from what they've heard about their elders, and that was their research.
So now looking at student engagement, do you find that with Indigenous students they have a stronger engagement in HPE than they would in history, or the other way around?
Well, generally, it depends on the child. Every child is an individual, and as a group, it's hard to make that call. But generally, children are engaged in academic work, or they're engaged in sporting activities. Sometimes some kids are involved in both, but some favour either way. But generally, the rate of engagement is the same with the individual child. Yeah, you treat them the same, and you encourage them the same.
How do classroom activities recognise the varied learning needs of Indigenous Australian students for all or nearly all of the lesson?
I'm going to think about this one student that I have, or these two students. The one girl loves writing poetry. That is part of, in her family, they are a family of writers. And she focuses on poetry, and so all the Indigenous poems and the writers and stuff really talk to her. So she had an assessment due recently that they had a writing activity, and because I know she likes the poetry, I gave her the option to write a poem, and she was able to show, because we were talking about global issues and comparing that in different countries and how people view that, and she was able to put that in a poem and get the emotion out, and that is how she expressed herself best.
So with that, do you think, even though we look at it as Indigenous students, so we're looking more at storytelling, we're looking at telling tales in a way of expressing knowledge, but I think there's also an aspect of seeing the individual student, not just saying, you're Indigenous, so this is the way that you want to go through?
Yes, definitely. And I think that's how we should be seeing all our students. But it does happen that sometimes people see, okay, right, you're Indigenous, so obviously it's just storytelling, for example. They get the labels where they're still individuals. And every single person is an individual in their own culture, and they all differ.
Well, from my experience teaching in Tasmania, Indigenous Australian students are just like everyone else. They they're fairly integrated. They don't have external communities that they come from, and so their learning needs are very similar to everyone else's learning needs. We incorporate storytelling in history. In PE not so much, but in history, storytelling, and that's the same whether they're Indigenous or not Indigenous.
And our last question is, how are culturally inclusive practices incorporated in relation to curriculum, including literacy and numeracy demands, classroom teaching, assessment and resource selection?
So resources, definitely it needs to be relevant to the students. I can't keep forcing American stories on them that has nothing to do with their culture or anything. It's good to learn about other cultures, but we also need to have traditional Indigenous Australian culture in our work, poems, novels, films, but making sure that it's relevant, that it's not dated. It is actually relevant, up to date. It is showing the culture as is now, and not what people thought it was 200 years ago.
Well, a lot of it boils down to showing due respect to the communities, for example, in the Welcome to Country, and we go through that and we explain what it means and we explain why it's important and why we do that as a country now. And when we're addressing issues such as Aboriginals in Tasmania in the 1800s, or whether it be Aboriginals fighting for civil rights in the 20th century, we look at things from both sides, but we look at it from their side, their point of view. We're sensitive to their plight, and as much as we'd be sensitive to the plight of Jews in the Holocaust or anyone else, it's just respect, and respect and empathy are the two key words, I would say.